color, no matter what gender, no matter what sexual orientation, no matter what religious identity, we decide to love. And when you love folk, you hate the fact that they're treated unjustly. You loathe the fact they're treated unfairly. And if you don't do something, the rocks are going to shout out, and the sun is going to shine, and the clouds are going to move. I want to thank my dear brother William Barr. I want to thank my dear sister Elizabeth Thea Harris for allowing God to use them in such a way that they are, in the language of John Coltrane, a force for good with a love supreme that embraces each and every one of us. And when you hear these voices, and I come from a people, a great people, a black people, who in the face of 400 years of chronic hatred keep dishing out love warriors every generation. So that the spirit of Frederick Douglass and the spirit of Sojourner Truth and the spirit of Fannie Lou Hamer and the spirit of Malcolm X and the spirit of Marcus Garvey say, these black folk gonna love themselves, and if we have the spiritual maturity, it's going to spill over from the chocolate part of town to the vanilla part of town. Oh, yes. It's going to spill over our precious indigenous brothers and sisters whose land was stolen as a precondition of the democracy. It's going to spill over to Spanish speaking. It's going to spill over to Asian. It's going to embrace everybody. But let us be very clear that this poor people's campaign is rooted in the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and James Lawson and Diane Nash in the 1960s, where we tried to break the back of a barbaric Jim Crow and Jane Crow and American apartheid, with the lynching on the one hand and the discrimination and degradation on the other. And what that means, that we say to America, not just to Congress, we say to the White House, we say to the Pentagon, we say to the neo-fascists in the Republican Party, we say to the milquetoast neoliberals in the Democratic Party, that we got a standard bigger than your politics. Somewhere I read, God is not mocked. You're going to reap what you sow. Malcolm X reminded us, chickens will come home to roost. And so when you hear the magnificent voices of such dignity in all parts of the country, and we are international, we in solidarity with oppressed people in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, in Latin America. How come? Well, I'll tell you why I am, because I'm a product of Shiloh Baptist Church. Just like my brother's a product of the black church. I was told in Vacation Bible School that if the kingdom of God is within you, then everywhere you go, you ought to leave a little heaven behind. And when you leave some heaven behind in a hellish world of organized greed and institutionalized hatred and routinized fear and overwhelming hypocrisy, you're going to have to be in the world but not of it. And so what we constitute is precisely that attempt to be in this empire, but not of it. We have moral and spiritual greatness that behooves us. That's why we're here. And let us never forget the rich humanity of the voices that we heard. That would straighten our backs up. And Brother Martin used to say, anytime everyday people in the language of Sly Stone, anytime ordinary people in the language of James Cleveland straighten their backs up, you're going somewhere, because folk can't ride your back unless it's bent. Let us forever move forward together and never ever, not one, not two, no step back. Thank you for both of the work that they have done. Let us work together, struggle together, go down together. And in the language of Duke Ellington, go down swinging, because it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that love swing in it.
some love, swing some truth, swing some justice, and keep on swinging till we knock racism out, and poverty out, and genocide out. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, keep on swinging, forward together. Not one step.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at Yeshiva University, Touro University, and John Jay College of Criminal Justice. The spiritual decay and breakdown of our culture should be obvious to all but the most morally compromised among us. It's rooted in a militarism on steroids that sees its dominance dependent on punishment, threats of punishment, and a worldview of never-ending violence, fear, and retribution. It's rooted in a free market fundamentalism that demeans and subjugates the poor and working classes as they catch hell here and around the world. It's a culture predicated on crimes against humanity in terms of mass incarceration, the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and a Wall Street bailout that led toward the collapse and crushing of millions of poor and working people's lives and their chances. It's a political and economic culture with an increasing authoritarianism that's become neo-fascistic in its expressions, run by a professional managerial class and ruling elites mesmerized by big money, running amok, and unaccountable. As Cornel West puts it, say anything, do everything, no answerability at all. The Radical Imagination has tried to develop and provide an alternative vision to the greed, hypocrisy, and milquetoast leadership of neoliberalism and the ugly thuggishness and gangsterization of a growing neo-fascism. Our guest today on the show is a longtime colleague and comrade from our Tikkun magazine and Yeshiva University days. His warmth, intelligence, humanity, and astute musings on the moral universe always makes for an interesting and dynamic dialogue. Thane Rosenbaum is a law professor, legal and Middle East analyst, novelist, essayist, and distinguished university professor at Touro University, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. He's a prolific author of numerous books of fiction and nonfiction, including The Myth of Moral Justice, Why Our Legal System Fails to Do What's Right, and his latest, Saving Free Speech from Itself. He writes a twice-monthly column for the Jewish Journal of Los Angeles and is legal analyst for CBS News Radio. He appears frequently on cable and television news programs, and happily, he's fast becoming a regular feature and fixture on the Radical Imagination. Thane, welcome.
Well, yeah, Jim, this is now my go-to show.
Okay, and you're my go-to guy too on so many different subjects. Seriously, you really do represent a fascinating, interesting, very important voice. And as you know, this show has been on for about 7 years now, close to 7 years. We've had numerous guests from all kinds of fields and walks in life, many progressive, radical, activist, scholars, comedians, you name it, Israeli filmmakers. I'm just trying to give you an idea a little bit of some of them. Barak Hyman, Lisa Harper has also been on. Serena Dykman, who has produced and directed an incredible documentary. I don't know if you're familiar with Nana, about her grandmother from the Holocaust. So anyway, we love having you here and loving to hear what you have to say about so many subjects that we are grappling with as a country and as a culture today.
Well, thank you, Jim. I'm happy to be here with you. You're always in the middle of things that are interesting, and you have a very lively, open mind. And I know that your audience appreciates having you as a fixture in their lives.
Thank you. That's very, very nice of you. And so tell me, Thane. We, again, as I mentioned, we go back several years to the Tikkun days, and you've made some changes in your thinking, in your philosophical orientation. Can you explain a little about your transition, your transformation? How would you describe it in terms of your understanding of what America's about, and where you stand on so many of the political economic issues?
Well, you're quite right. We met each other on Tikkun, which for those of us that were part of that magazine then and now, but certainly then it was, very much considered a Jewish progressives home base, on social issues and Israel. And I was the literary editor for 6 years. But everyone always assumes, and maybe they're right and I'm wrong, that I've made a big change. I think everyone else has changed, and I've been standing in the same spot. I don't believe I've moved an inch. People are saying, look how conservative you got. No, I was. If you would have asked me then, I would have said I have progressive credentials, bona fides, for sort of reasons, partly associated with Tikkun, but I'm an old school liberal.
What does that mean, Thane? Help our audience understand. A classical liberal, a social liberal.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Help our audience understand that.
So if you go, to the true era of the philosophers of the late 18th century, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, Hume. Liberalism understood in those terms, and I think at least practiced by people like me, essentially means to be open, to believe in civil rights and the rule of law, and a sense of proceduralism, a sense of, I would say, dispassion when it comes to analyzing different issues. An understanding of open, free speech, open inquiry, and an openness to conflicting ideas,
right,
without rejecting them in hysteria. To be, when I think of, it's so funny when I think about, Obama was elected president, and people didn't say this, but there were many progressives that were disappointed in his presidency, because they thought he would govern as a progressive, and he didn't really. Ironically, his vice president is governing like a progressive, but he wasn't. And people were very critical of him. I thought I understood what he was doing, but I remembered thinking of him as a classic liberal. He was cool, right? He wasn't hysterical. He was a grown-up. He wasn't like immature, like a Donald Trump, or touchy. He was procedural, civil, right? A civilized man who was able to process information, and not in a reasoned, rational, thorough, deliberate manner. To me, a liberal is someone who can hold conflicting ideas in alternating hands and say the following. And I don't think anyone can say that anymore. These are interesting thoughts, both of them. I don't sure exactly where I am here. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to walk away for a week. I'm going to think about it, and I'll come back.
I can't disagree with anything you said so far.
Today, you're a racist if you don't immediately know that this thing in your hand is wrong and must be denounced and condemned. And if you don't immediately, and that is where the political culture has changed in a way that is very unfamiliar to me, and very, in my mind, unpleasant. I come from a world that truly believes in the life of the mind, and an openness to ideas, and an understanding of human complexity, and the recognition of that's the whole concept to deliberate, right? Let me give this some thought, Jim, and I'll come back next week. I don't actually know anyone now who says anything like that. They immediately denounce, they moralize, they condemn, they cancel.
But Thane, okay,
they shriek. Shrieking is good.
Are we talking about progressives?
Yes.
Radical right?
I would say both sides for sure.
Bring this on both.
But the difference is, and it's because, you know, my sensitivity is it's on both sides. It just, in my mind, the far right is powerless, literally powerless. The university life is completely a captive of this hard left. Mainstream media is a captive of hard left. Major museums are captives of this new progressivism. And I look at the hard right as thinking, you mean we're talking about the Oath Keepers? I mean, you know, clowns? I mean, we're talking about some people out in Montana or the Oath, you know, I mean, this is just ridiculous. You're talking about people who really, it's a small community and they're utterly powerless. And so I don't find myself in a position having to argue with them. I don't really get to see them. I'm sure they're there somewhere.
You didn't see them on January 6th? You were comment on this, right?
I will tell you that I'll tell you this.
Tell me.
And you know, because you know I cover this sort of stuff for CBS News, radio. People don't realize there were 30,000 people in Washington, D.C. for that rally, whatever you want to call the rally. 800 were arrested for unlawfully entering the Capitol. And fewer than 10% of the 800 were members of an affiliated group, Oath Keepers or Proud Boys.
Okay.
So that is something that most people don't know. Most people watching Radical Imagination will say, "What? He can't be right." No, it's right. Look it up.
Absolutely.
Look it up.
You are.
It's just right. So that means that around 700 people who were arrested, the vast, vast, vast majority, didn't really know each other and certainly didn't plan ahead. They couldn't be part of a conspiracy because they didn't show up with a plan. And that's what seditious conspiracy legally requires. So, which is why when you're watching this new movie that was put out by the Congressional Select Committee on the investigation of January 6th, you know, you see the people who were Oath Keepers and Proud Boys who were essentially are either now or have been indicted for seditious conspiracy, but the other people were convicted or pled guilty to variations of criminal trespass.
And what is Trump's role in all of this, if any? What would you say in terms of that?
All I know is that
legal and moral or whatever.
Legally, from everything that I've been seeing over the last 4 days, including it's in the background right now. The sound is off because I'm with my buddy Jim Vrados on his show, but I had thought that on day one the committee was going to produce some evidence that linked the president and his men to the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. Okay. Some conversations, text messages, some association that they knew what was happening on January 6th, as in the Oval Office, and they were encouraging them to do so. And that nothing like that has been presented. So right. I don't see where as of yet, although again, if you were going to hire a primetime producer for a right. nighttime hearing, I'm not Mr. Hollywood. I would have unloaded it then. I would have said, hey, you're on. This is primetime television, ladies and gentlemen. Check this out. This is our buffoon of a president giving orders to people to smash windows and go, attack members of Congress and string up the vice president.
So you're not worried, Thane, I just want to really understand this. When you say, as I think you said a few minutes ago, the far right is powerless, you don't think that much of the agenda of this country is rooted in the sort of thinking that I described in the opening here, and you're not worried about the threat of a neo-fascist version really becoming more and more prominent in America. And I just also want to follow up on that and wonder if you were aware or observed the Poor People's campaign, and that was on June. That was on just this past weekend too, June 18th. And I wonder what you think of that in terms of a progressive agenda and policies. And it seems to me, at the very least, there's a tremendous difference between what Reverend Barber, who's been on this show, and Cornel West, who I quoted in the opening, are saying, and what you're saying dominates the country.
Of the list that you provided at the beginning, that to me is a list of something I totally sympathetic to, which is economic crime, right? The extraordinary disparity in wealth and wealth creation in the United States, the disproportionate amount of wealth and the gap.
But have the progressives, I'll interrupt you 1 second. Is that the progressives doing?
No, not at all. But it's not the far right. It's not. If you listen,
what the hell is it then? Neoliberals?
Well, let me just say, I'm saying if you're listening to the president, look, the man is barely conscious. But if you listen to the president,
which one of the past several that we've had
the
since
one that
Reagan?
we presently have, he invoked the word white supremacy relentlessly. The most important thing in the United States, the biggest threat to our country. It's just absurd. It's not white supremacy.
What is
what
it?
You're describing to me? What you're describing can't even be pinned to white supremacy. So when I'm saying, if you're saying in terms of dialogue and conversation, in the progressive sphere, at least when it comes to universities and mainstream media, the ear of the people that make those decisions are much more sympathetic to progressives than to people on the hard right. So yes, is there it still continues? This is a capitalist nation.
Right.
Is there still fundamental unfairness built into the system? Yes. Is there still racism in the United States? Absolutely. It's just not systemic racism. That's something else that again, the president is being told to say things, so he says things, and I'm sure there are people on the show that'll be offended by what I said. That's okay. Get in line. People get offended by.
No. Explain. We want to hear that.
There's no systemic race. There's racism. Just like I'm saying, as a Jew, I can tell you right now, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the United States, but you would never hear me say there's systemic anti-Semitism. I would say there is anti-Semitism in the culture and in the hearts of people, and there's an extraordinary amount of racism in the culture and in the hearts of people. But to degrade and devalue the extraordinary progress that was made in racial injustice and that has been totally trashed these last 2 years of critical race theory and Black Lives Matter, as if, you hear morons like that. What's his name? That the actors in African American. It's never been worse than it is today, he says in his mansion. It's never been worse than today. Voting Rights Act, the integration of schools, affirmative action, welfare, food stamps, rules barring discrimination in public accommodations.
So much of that has been cut back by the court
in housing
and by policy state, right?
In housing, yeah, but it's not within the system, and I don't see what you're talking about. Like when you say in the policies, like what policy are we talking about that has rolled back the clock?
Voter suppression.
Well, I don't know what that means. If you're saying that it's voter suppression to require African Americans and white Americans to have government issue IDs in order to verify their ballots, if you're going to tell me that's an example of voter suppression, I'm going to say it's just nonsense. If you're talking about things that are part of a new wave of voting that came out in conjunction with the pandemic that resulted in tens of millions of ballots, that some of which might have had problems, had defects that in an ordinary election might have been invalidated. And by the way, some of the judges,
you said tens of millions. I'm sorry, the figure you
there
used.
were tens of millions of people that voted by mail, Jim.
Yeah. Okay. So you're not saying that? Are you saying that you had the possibilities of tens of millions of ballots?
No.
Okay.
I'm saying the process. Yeah, I'm just saying that when people took a look at the election and said, maybe we shouldn't allow for ballot harvesting or mobile drop-off points,
right?
Or if we're talking about,
okay,
or government issued, not requiring government issue. I mean, to me, one of the most racist comments I've ever heard was from a friend of mine who said, "Black people don't have driver's license; they don't drive. This is a white guy." And I literally just walked away from him because I was so embarrassed.
Right.
I lived for 12 years in Harlem, and everyone who was my neighbor was African American. And I didn't know anyone who either didn't have a car and didn't know that the DMV was on Martin Luther King Boulevard, 125th Street. I didn't know anybody. So I can't think of anything more racist than saying African Americans are incapable of having a government issued ID. So no, those to me are not examples of voter suppression.
Right.
They're not.
So we're talking about excesses of statements that come out both on the right and left. It seems that that's your major gripe here.
But the cancellation, Jim, whatever the cancel culture, the right has no power in that. The right has not exercised any muscle to get people fired. It just hasn't happened. If you look at actors, people working in corporations, the people that got fired are people that had a tweet from years ago that might have been misunderstood, or were caught in a blackface at some point, or had a Parler account. There simply is no cancellation on the right. The closing down of Twitter accounts and other social media didn't happen to people who were progressives. I know of no progressive that had his or her voice became voiceless on social media because they were too left wing. I've never heard of that. So that's why when you ask me, I think I don't see, they seem incomparable, the distinction between the hard right and the hard left. Okay. The hard right are people, lunatics without any power, except that they could show up on January 6th and unlawfully trash the Capitol building.
So you're not worried about that element fully taking over the country, perhaps in an election of Trump again? You don't think that that's going to happen? Not a chance.
I think that one thing that people aren't saying, Jim, is that Donald Trump did not call out for martial law. He left on his own accord, unhappily, but he left. And if anything, I would say the election was a stress test of our democracy, and we passed. It was, we were dealing with the worst of a candidate in Donald Trump. The very opposite of as I said before about Obama, not procedural, not deliberate, none of the things that Obama was when he came to the White House. And despite his desire to reject the results of the election, he's gone.
Do you think the policies of Obama, which basically you're right, I agree with you, moderate to moderately liberal, middle of the road Democrat, neoliberal still, do you think that is something that we should be working toward in this country? Or do you think that it's been part of the problem?
I think that the progressive left, social democrats, however you want to describe them, and their war on language and their war on bathrooms and their war on gender, the war that you're seeing has done everything. You couldn't go more out of your way to return Donald Trump to the presidency. After Trump's presidency, I could have imagined 20 years of Democratic elections in the White House.
Interesting. Okay.
I would just say the in my view, the utter nonsense that we've been seeing has galvanized red state voters, and we're going to see this in the midterm. And I would be very surprised if Donald Trump is not elected, and yet it won't stop. It won't.
I believe he
stop.
will be elected.
The focus continues to be on the wrong thing.
So you do believe he will be elected? You think that there's a good chance he might?
I think the Democrats can't help themselves. They just can't. They can't. And I'm a member of the Democratic Party, and I voted for Joe Biden, of course.
Right.
And I look at this with great, lamentation and say, how stupid are you? How stupid are you to spend?
Look, there's enough stupid people around on all sides. And I agree with some of what you're saying there. That
the right wing doesn't have any power to make their stupidity real.
Okay, well, but what about the agenda again that Reverend Barber was talking about? If that came, the fusion politics that he's talking about, particularly in the South, that would bring about the sort of social policies that would aid not only poor blacks but majority of poor whites. Wouldn't that be a way of progressives capturing the political moment of the time rather than the milquetoast leadership, which is not here nor there, as you point out, can hardly spell his name and so on. The weakness is with the neoliberal policies and the fact that they don't take an aggressive enough progressive stand, which, almost finished, the majority of people in the country have always supported, right? In terms of national health insurance, for example.
But if you spend your days, as the Democratic Party does, calling white people racists,
but you're lumping together a whole bunch of people there.
White people who this is what you've been describing since your show opened is about class. It's not about race. It's about class. You didn't say the words because you're not stupid. But most people who would sit in your chair would have, by this point, used the word racism 150 times. I'm saying what you've done, what has happened is they have marshaled the forces of poor white people that should otherwise be part of a progressive movement. Yes. And have so disgusted them to the point that they don't want to have anything to do with the Democratic Party. Whether they live in, why do you think there's losing votes among Hispanics, right? I mean, poor people, they're not against the police. They shouldn't be against the police, defunding the police. Poor people are not in favor of crime, right? The incarceration rate is a racial issue. Right, but by focusing entirely as a racist issue,
you meant more a class, didn't you?
It's really about class.
Mass incarceration is class and disproportionately.
No, I think it's. I'm willing to say it's race. I'm willing to say that it's race, but by doing it, by only using these, by only allowing, sanctifying certain words, which is. Everything is racist. There is a large demographic of poor white people that are being driven, have been driven into the arms of Donald Trump and his minions.
Okay, I see your point on that. I agree.
Poor white people don't think of themselves as privileged, Jim. They just don't. So if they're going to be told repeatedly about their privilege and that they should shut up because they're white, and white people should just listen to black people and people of color because that's where wisdom and virtue comes from. It comes from people of color, and white is just sinful. There's no good that comes from it.
I really don't think that that's what Black Lives Matter is saying, or certainly not the people that I'm listening to. People like Reverend Barber or Cornel West and so on. They're talking about a radical love that transforms all
Yeah.
people and is connected to all people. And the people that I've had on the show here, from that perspective, have emphasized.
No,
that.
I think you have, but I think you have to admit
Yeah,
that if you're paying attention in the public sphere,
yeah.
right, if you're actually just paying attention, that's what you're hearing. You're not hearing what Korn says.
Okay, let's turn to an issue, to a topic that I think I do have a great deal of alliance with you on. Some of the excesses of the statements that are made against Israel. On the other hand, what is your position in terms of a possible peace in the area? If you're not going to have a two-state solution, if you're going to be supportive of a government, and I'm not saying you are, let's talk about that continues the settlements, that continues to build walls to create a situation in which the bulk of Arab lives feel, it's impossible to really live a decent life. Where is, and if you're going to reject the Tikkunish progressive stand, what does that leave you with? I want to understand what you're.
I just don't know whether most people who listen to Radical Imagination realize that there have been 5 rejected peace proposals by the Palestinian government or putative leaders. 5 from 1947 until 2008. There were 5 rejected peace proposals. And one of the things that I think came out of the Trump presidency, again, he wouldn't be credited with it, is I think a much more honest assessment of Palestinian intentions. And I was at Tikkun for 6 years, so it's not like I don't understand.
I understand.
It's not like I don't understand. Mutual caring and connection. It's like I understand the language of Tikkun. I get it, but I do think that it's time to say, is it possible? Because I think the Gulf states have made this decision. Is it possible that the Palestinians like terror more than statehood? That they really aren't that interested in nation building. It's very hard to do. And what they're really interested is not living beside a Jewish state. They want not a binational state. They want a state where it's, from the river to the sea. When people are chanting to the river to the sea, what they're saying is no Jews.
But aren't you making tremendous generalizations here?
No, that's exactly what they're saying.
The majority of Palestinians believe that.
Yes.
The leadership has not said that.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Okay.
That's what the BDS movement, that's exactly what we've done. And I would say it's very similar to the conversation we've been having before, is infantilizing the Palestinians, like we often are infantilizing African Americans by saying they couldn't possibly get government issued ID cards. They're saying you couldn't possibly ask Palestinians to not stab Israelis. When you talk about a wall, the Israelis didn't build a wall for reasons other than the second intifada resulted in too many bombings of pizza shops and hotels and buses, and no civilized society can do that. So they built a wall for security purposes. It's called the security fence. It's not there for any other reasons. I think the Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, polling has shown they were very happy to live in peace beside a Palestinian state. Remember, no country on the planet, again, most of your viewers don't know this, has given up more land than Israel. No other country on earth has given up more land.
So when I hear you saying,
in return for which there are sustaining peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan.
right.
And if you were following Middle East geopolitics from 1948 until the 90s, you wouldn't even say the Palestinians said Israel is at war with Egypt and Jordan and Syria, right? And you'd say, you don't say that anymore. Israel is not at war with Egypt and Jordan. Its main
as cold a peace as it. So when I hear you saying, Thane, am I correct? You are still for, or are you a two-state solution?
Of course. But I also think that it's infantilizing and intellectually dishonest to, when one points to why there isn't a Palestinian state, to point the finger at Israel. It's to me laughable and anti-Semitic. It's either ignorant because the person hasn't really done enough reading, and I hope someone's listening to this and goes, you know what, I hate this guy worse than anything, but maybe I should do some reading. Maybe
no one hates you. We're not hating you.
Maybe I don't have a clue what I'm saying. 5 efforts at peace, and they rejected each one. And yeah, they rejected each one because in the end, there was no right of return. There was no idea that, that the Palestinians' leadership is very clear. We are not settling with Israel if there is an Israel. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't more moderate Palestinians out there, but they're certainly not represented in Hamas, and they're not represented in the Palestinian Authority. Palestinians have managed to squander every opportunity, and they have been represented by corrupt people that own villas in Europe and have done little.
True. But Thane, also, as you know, these are Hamas. These are organizations that have also been, in a way, created and supported by Israel to divide and conquer. Are you not saying that that's
not? I don't think that's true anymore. But yes, I think that's true. I mean, look, it's just like the United States supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan without realizing that one day they would be fighting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. This happens, So
isn't that now, Thane? That's what you just touched on. Isn't that the issue? This endless back and forth of wars and retribution and punishment in our criminal justice system and punishment. I don't know if I've told you, but we are setting up an institute for the prevention of violence with Jim Gilligan, the psychiatrist, and Bandy Lee.
Yeah.
And they've been in the forefront of creating a situation where, no, you can't let everyone out of prison. We're not talking about that. But you don't use punishment. You restrain people. You offer them the sort of aid and services and bring them up to a point in their lives. Because the great majority of people who have been violent were violated themselves and treated horribly as children. And that's where that comes from. So how do we deal with this never-ending cycle? Whether it's Palestinians, Israelis, whether it's drug wars on crime, whether we want to throw the police, the military at all our problems, or do we turn more toward a perspective that I don't want to categorize here, but that uses radical love and a more therapeutic understanding of the human condition. And it seems to me that's what this show has been trying to do as well. It's difficult to find that root because people are it's easy to go back to, we're sick and tired of it. Yeah, Putin and all this. These are very damaged human beings. Nobody is saying, allow this to happen. But it seems to me that we need to have an alternative vision and policies. And I don't see that coming from neoliberals and certainly the far right.
Well, it won't come from the far right, and there's less likely to come now. And let me just go back to, Black Lives Matter. I blame a lot of this on the post-George Floyd tragic killing.
A lot of what?
A lot of the difficulties that progressives are going to continue to have. I already discussed one of them, which is if in the post-George Floyd, during the pandemic, this endless fixation, focus that race is the primary problem in the United States, that has not served the interest of the progressive side in the end, for the reasons I stated, because it has alienated poor white people. And I would say another element of the post-George Floyd era, the defunding the police, has resulted in the recall of progressive prosecutors. And so what you've discussed in this radical love orientation is something that I think would have been something much easier for people to embrace until what we saw as in the defunding the police, which you're still seeing this massive spike in crime, this sense that lawlessness is accepted. And you're going to have a very hard time, unfortunately, showing with the videos of people smashing into Apple stores and CVS's and Walgreens and saying, these are all people. I mean, you can say it. I'm just saying, will you have an audience of voters certainly even in blue states that are going to say, you're right, those people were all damaged in their own way, and they should not be in jail, and they should be treated in a different way?
Well, where I would agree with you on is that the policy should reflect a class-based hatred of all people, and that we need to support those policies that will bring white, blue, green, everybody into that system in a much better way than we've been able to do.
Look, one of the books you mentioned of mine, The Myth of Moral Justice, has a lot of chapters on restorative justice. You know, I think I'm a problem for progressives because I come from that world. And I've written, but my writings have so much of the feeling, the flavor. You know, you're talking about a law professor that wrote about restorative justice. Nobody even refers to that term of art in conventional law school curricula or in most books. That's considered just too crazy. Everyone knows justice must be retributive, purely prosecutorial and punitive, not restorative. So I'm someone who's extremely sympathetic, but I'm also sympathetic to sort of like just a common sense, again, a liberal's perspective, not an ideologue's perspective, a progressive ideologue, but a liberal's perspective, which is this. Yeah, it would be great for restorative justice purposes to respond to crime with radical love. But this shit with smash and grab has to stop. And these people need to be picked up off the street and put in jail. Something has to happen. And people that have committed
what has to happen? What has to happen with people who are doing these?
There are career criminals that simply shouldn't be on the street. And they just shouldn't. And what you're seeing now, and by the way, people who suffer from this most are poor people, because career criminals commit most crime. This is why, again, here's a real problem. It's racist to discuss what black on black crime, right? So when I was on, tour during the pandemic, which was all virtual in connection with my last book, I was talking about, things that you're simply not allowed to say, right? Things that attack on free speech. I think discussing black on black crime is essential, but we're in a progressive's mindset. What I just said is racist. So,
well, not on this show. And
okay, and I'm saying, if you really want to talk about radical love, Jim, you have to recognize it starts with having poor African Americans that live in densely urban populations, that they don't feel victimized by career criminals, that they feel
and on a positive note, that there are efforts to open up opportunities and good schooling in particular, and healthcare and housing and so on, that people feel that there is these other avenues that they can pursue. You wouldn't disagree with that, would you?
Not.
Of course not. So we're on the same page on that.
No, I'm just saying the difference is that what I'm pointing out to your audience, I doubt it will be well received. But when
it's well received, I'm receiving it very well. It's what Jim Gilligan and Bandy Lee talk about in prison, restorative justice. Jim was the head of the Department of Mental Hygiene in Massachusetts prison system for 20 years. He reduced the level of homicide and suicide there to zero. And the one and only variable was that you got your college degree. And those who got in the prison system, and you got that degree, and you were much less likely to commit violence.
I'm sure that's true.
It
I'm
is
sure that's
true.
The
It's
question
all-
is, I'm sure that's true. The question
We
is,
did introduce that maybe at Touro.
the real question is, if the mayor of Chicago brought Jim in as a consultant
Right.
to completely overhaul the prison
Right.
system in Chicago, would that be a fix or a dramatic change in the statistics on black on black crime? Because that's what needs to happen. Because I also think, the people that live within that world of drugs and crime, high crime, are just not in a position to benefit from the opportunities that might be presented to African Americans and other poor people. I think
Well, what you're saying, Thane, is it is a large problem. It's not just within the black community, but you are talking about opening up life chances in a way of course. That means a shift in resources and a shift in our thinking and in our morality. But stop demonizing the poor.
But do you also believe, this is what I'm saying, a true liberal? I'm saying I agree with everything that you just said. And I would applaud every effort to achieve what you would like to achieve. But I also think there's some people who are career criminals and no college degree is going to make a difference to them. No opportunity for a college degree is something that they would respond to. And that middle class white America, red states, need to see that progressives are also interested in responding to the increase in crime as well, right? I just think this is where there is a tremendous disconnect, and I can see, the midterm elections being so held hostage by the debates that we're seeing in public schools over gender and sex, by the 1619 Project's emphasis on teaching everything through a lens of critical race theory, where that everything is sort of focused on oppression, imperialism. When we talk about Israel, I think, Israel, more than half the population are people of color, but you can't get a progressive to acknowledge that. To them, it is a settler colonial enterprise, instead of saying, no, it's a pluralistic nation where more than half the country are people of color, that had an Ethiopian Miss Israel, and that have had Arabs
who are Jewish, though.
Who are Jewish, right? I mean, this is not a racist nation. Show me any Arab country where homosexuals and people of color are not, or Christians for that matter, are not persecuted. There's only one country that you could live in if you're gay, a woman, or a Christian in all of the Middle East. It's Israel. There is no other country that would welcome you. And you don't hear progressives, again, this is the intellectual dishonesty. You don't hear progressives say what I just said.
Well, we got to continue. Unfortunately, we're overtime as usual here.
That happens.
But it happens. But we want you again to come on.
I'll always come back for you. You know that.
And the one thing I do want to, because we were agreeing 2 minutes ago, we were agreeing on almost everything there. And then one last fast little question.
Sure.
Redemption. Is that possible for everyone? Is it? And by the way, there are people that possibly, a small number, will have to remain under some sort of institutional care, no question about it. But let's end it on a positive note. Within our Judaic Christian culture, isn't the idea of redemption something that? Okay, great.
We should always be aspiring to human betterment in every way possible.
All right, terrific. On that note of redemption, God bless us all. God, thank you so much, Thane.
Anytime for you, my friend Jim.
I love you.
I love you.
All right, and we'll talk soon again.
All right. Good luck. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.
Stay tuned to Jim Vredas' show.
And check you out on CBS and your analysis on CBS Radio as well.
Thank
and on
you.
CNN and wherever else you show up, which is all places.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you again. And thank you so very, very much. This is Jim Vredos again for the Radical Imagination. Thanks for listening to us, and we'll see you again next week on the Radical Imagination.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing, all you gotta do is swing. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Just give that rhythm every little thing you've got. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.